On October 12, 1935, the Vancouver Sun in Canada ran a front-page article that would have immediately captured the attention of just about anyone passing by. It read, "Husband seeks ban on cult," and the contents were bizarre and salacious. There were allegations of theft, hypnosis, mysterious telephone calls, and even a kidnapping. Little was known about this strange Vancouver sect or the man that led them. Who were they, and did they really hypnotize a woman, ultimately kidnapping her? This is the story of the bizarre cult of Brother Carson and the Solar Temple. This video is kindly sponsored by Manta Sleep, and I've spoken about them before on this channel, and I genuinely only have good things to say. I've personally been using the Manta sound mask that comes with built-in Bluetooth headphones, and let me tell you, this is an absolute game changer, especially for me because I have an incredibly bizarre sleeping schedule. I'll be real, sometimes the light is creeping in through my curtains by the time I'm even thinking about going to bed, and with the Manta Sleep masks, I can block out the pesky sun completely. And if you're thinking, well, that's all well and good, Emily, but I'm a side sleeper, do not fret, because the Manta masks are not only completely adjustable, but they come with C-shaped eye cups, which make them perfect for side sleepers. These sleep masks are so comfortable, and they're great for so many different scenarios. If you've got a long car journey or a red-eye flight, or even if you just want a nice daytime nap. And let's be real, sometimes we all need a daytime nap. You can go to mantasleep.com and use my code WEIRDREADS to get 10% off your first order and start experiencing great sleep today. Before we begin, I think it's important to talk a little bit about the New Thought movement in North America, because the cult that we're talking about today was firmly planted under that umbrella. Although New Thought can trace its origins far back in history, it really kicked off in the United States in the mid-1800s. One of the most influential figures was a man named Phineas Quimby, and he'd been inspired by Anton Mesmer and his theory of animal magnetism. Mesmer believed that there was an invisible magnetic force that flowed through all living things, and by controlling it with magnets or laying on hands, he could influence the flow, clear out blockages, and ultimately heal people from sickness. He's known as the father of modern hypnosis, and his name is where the words mesmerism and mesmerized come from. Quimby built on Mesmer's ideas. He was very much into hypnotism and mesmerism, and he eventually created his own doctrine. He believed that the body was merely the house in which the mind dwells, and that diseases were caused not by a blockage in this mysterious magnetic force, but because of our negative thinking. Mary Baker Eddy was a student of Quimby's, and she went on to found Christian Science. Their focus was healing the sick and raising the dead. Another important organisation that sits under the New Thought umbrella is the Unity Church, which was founded by Charles and Myrtle Fillmore in 1889, after Myrtle had supposedly been cured of tuberculosis via spiritual healing. They believed that the Bible was a metaphysical representation of humankind's evolutionary journey towards spiritual awakening, and they taught that our thoughts have creative power to influence events and determine our experiences. In the late 1800s and into the early 1900s, the New Thought movement shifted its focus. It became less about curing ailments and more about creating abundance. These guys got really into the idea of manifesting prosperity and material possessions through positive thought. They were all about the law of attraction, and some, not all, enjoyed telling people that the reason that they were poor is because they were so bloody negative. The idea was that you could change your material conditions through changing your thought patterns. And while positive thinking is clearly a good thing, these guys had a tendency to take it a little too far, veering into victim blaming territory and putting the onus on the individual for their own circumstances instead of society at large. This is where it tends to dovetail nicely with libertarianism. By the 1920s, there were so many different New Thought groups that it's almost impossible to track them all. Look through any newspaper back then, and you'll see that the classified ads and notices for religious meetings were full of these kinds of groups. All that is to say that the Unity Fellowship in Vancouver wasn't exactly unique. Formed in 1928, they held lectures, healing circles and music sessions at the Colonial Theatre, and by the 1930s the local newspapers in Vancouver were writing about how successful they'd gotten. They said that new thought at the Unity Fellowship is attracting ever-increasing interest, as evidenced by the large numbers attending the services. The organisation is in no sense a church, and not intended to be a competitor to them. The real work of the Fellowship, in truth, is to emphasise the teachings and to unfold the metaphysics of the writings of St. Paul. The Fellowship was led by Dr. T. Christie Hipp. He was born in England and had come to Vancouver in the early 1920s, and he became the district president for Western Canada of the International New Thought Alliance. He gave lectures at the Unity Fellowship with titles like An Evening with the Mystics of the Ages, The Mystery of Dreams, and Man, King of Mind, Body and Circumstances. The papers described the Unity Fellowship as the largest and most flourishing New Thought group in the Pacific Northwest, and a journalist remarked that he had been visiting churches all over the city, and that in all of them the needs of the city and the whole country had been discussed. Yet here was a minister who was talking about the mystery of dreams. The speakers declared that it would take a week to go through the whole gamut of dream interpretation. Evidently, the speaker had a complete stock of dream lore. The illusions of an emaciated figure crouched at the foot of the bed and slowly creeping, with extended talons, toward the dreamer is induced by a later supper of cold pork, said the speaker. I glanced about, trying to discover if this large, intelligent-looking Sunday evening congregation could be serious. It was. I feel like I point this out in every video that I make about a religious group in the 1920s and 30s, and this video will be no exception. We're in the Great Depression, and in 1933 in Canada, 30% of people were out of work. Times were extremely tough, and there seemed to be a proliferation of these groups that took these fairly newly popularized esoteric and occult teachings and turned them into commercial enterprises. For what it's worth, I don't necessarily think that the Unity Fellowship or Dr. Hipp had that goal in mind. From everything I've read, it sounded like he was a true believer, and he appeared to be at least somewhat altruistic. But when he decided to pack up his belongings and move from Vancouver to Victoria, he left a power vacuum that was quickly filled by a man who may have been motivated by something more nefarious. Edna Blumberger, by her own admission, had too much time on her hands. When describing how she became involved in the Unity Fellowship, and eventually the Solar Temple, she spoke about how her son was grown up, that she had servants to do the household duties, and that her husband was away at nights because of his job as a doctor. She was incredibly affluent, but she said that she had little spiritual stimulation, and she needed an outlet. That's where the Unity Fellowship came in. In May 1935, Dr. T. Christie Hipp moved to Victoria, and it appeared that his wife Emily stayed behind in Vancouver. In his new city, Dr. Hipp set up shop at Hatts Hall under the name Unity Fellowship. But back in Vancouver, the group there appeared to be under new management. A small notice appeared in the local press, announcing that a group calling themselves the Solar Temple were absorbing the Unity Fellowship. I'm not sure exactly when Edna began attending the Unity Fellowship, but it was in June that Emily Hipp told her about a new teacher who, according to her, was heading up a character-building movement which involved the abnegation of self and the service of mankind. She told us that she would introduce us to this teacher, Peter Carson, but warned us not to judge by appearances. Carson appears to have come on the scene in June 1935, and I'm unsure whether he was in communication with Dr. Hipp beforehand. The first trace that I could find of the Solar Temple in my research is from the 1st of June, and an advertisement for a talk by Dr. James E. Dodds. On an interesting side note, Dodds had studied at the University of Metaphysics in Portland, Oregon, founded by Reverend Irma Wells, who was the pastor of the Church of Truth. That just gives you a small glimpse at how many of these New Thought congregations there actually were. They all sit under this umbrella movement, and a lot of them share the same teachings and oftentimes even the same names, so it can make keeping track of them one hell of a task. Peter Carson, or Brother Carson as he was known, was described as a fair-haired, blue-eyed, insignificant-looking little man with a front tooth missing.
The shade of it all.
He apparently bounced around for all the world like a performer on the vaudeville stage, dressed in white flannels and a yellow sweater. Edna said that his eyes had a peculiar intensity, and she claimed that he could enlarge them at will. To me, sounds like someone I'd immediately avoid, but he seemed to have some kind of allure. These confidence men often do. On their first meeting, he supposedly spent a while looking at Edna and eventually told her that she was ready for the truth, whatever that was supposed to mean. For a woman like her, a self-admitted spiritual seeker who was fed up with the emptiness of her day-to-day life, it's not hard to see how she quickly fell under his spell. He asked her to fill out an application form to become an attendee at the Solar Temple's classes, and Edna quickly became addicted.
I cannot tell you exactly why I continued to go to the lectures. I got so absorbed in the thought of character building that I could occupy my mind with little else. You see, he told us that his were the esoteric teachings of Christ as they had been given to his disciples, not the parables through which Christ manifested his gospel to the common people.
She said that Peter would deliver invocations and the attendees would be told to stare at an orange-coloured triangle on the wall. The whole point was so that they could concentrate their minds and focus on uplifting thoughts. To me, it sounds like the deliberate encouragement of a somewhat dissociative state, perhaps to make his followers more suggestible.
Peter told us that he was a priest of the Temple of Sarah and that his name was Avaloki Teswali. He said that he was invested with the power of willing people to death, something along the lines of voodoo witch doctors.
I tried searching the name Avaloki Teswali, and the only reference is Edna's story. It could be a mispronunciation or a mistype of the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, also known as the Lord who looks down. As for the Temple of Sarah, there was one reference in September 1935 in the local Vancouver press. It referred to Brother Carson as the Temple Master of Golden Lodge, Temple Sarah, Tibet. It's unclear whether Carson ever actually went to Tibet or whether he just took the name. I wouldn't be surprised if he told people that he'd been there. It was a surprisingly popular grift back then to say that you'd been studying in Tibet with the masters of ancient wisdom, and people really just had to take you at your word. Now that I'm thinking about it, it's actually still a popular grift today. Some things never change. In classic cult leader fashion, Brother Carson soon announced that he was to marry a white sister, and although the term is never elaborated on, it sounds like his theology was a hodgepodge of different religions and spiritual thought. White sister could be a reference to theosophy, or he could have got it from a silent movie. Who bloody knows? Also, I just want to point out one of my favourite tweets here about a male cult leader having a revelation from the Lord where he's to have multiple wives. It always seems to happen, doesn't it? And you won't be shocked if I tell you that his chosen bride was a woman named Rebecca Barrett, who apparently had an extremely rich grandfather and was effectively an heiress. Edna claimed that after the wedding, Peter began weeding out members of the class. She said,
Some of these discarded ones, he said, were too emotional. The others, particularly the men, were the ones who used to get up and ask him awkward questions. He used to say that these questioners were practicing black magic.
That's a convenient way to discredit and disenfranchise every single person that dares to question you. You can just tell your followers that they're evil and they're not to be trusted. It seems clear that Carson was adamant on creating an inner circle of hardened followers who had discarded their critical thinking and trusted in him implicitly. Edna said that at this point her husband was growing worried. She was spending a lot of time at the Solar Temple. She'd found the spirituality that she'd desperately been seeking, speaking. In a bid to try and curtail her involvement, her husband sent their son Joey to these meetings to keep a watchful eye over the proceedings. She claimed that Joey would ask brother Carson embarrassing questions, presumably trying to show his mother just how much of a fraud he was. Sadly, it didn't seem to work. Brother Carson had to get control of the reins. He couldn't allow people to come in and commit the grave sin of asking him questions. Heaven forbid the entire operation was at risk from these pesky skeptics. So he did what any good cult leader would do, and he began to close the ranks.
Our group dwindled to a select number of inner souls, and then Peter decided to move the temple down to 1205 Comox Street, the boarding house conducted by Mrs. Thorne.
Edna claimed that Carson had an income of $450 a month, and although he was never clear about where that came from, he did ask his followers to contribute towards the mission. To put his income into context, we're talking nearly 10,000 Canadian dollars a month in today's money. If this number was true, then he was absolutely raking it in during the Depression. And it's not exactly surprising given the people that he seemed to be targeting. It was affluent women like Edna and his supposed heiress wife.
Peter told us he had to have a gong made of gold, silver, and bronze. Upon this gong, he said, he sent messages to Sarah. We gave him trinkets of gold, silver, and bronze, which were going to be melted down and put into the gong. But I afterwards found out that the gong actually in use was made of bronze and tin.
There's no doubt in my mind that Edna was somewhat of a prized cash cow for Carson. She was so enamoured with him that she even gave him 20 paintings to decorate the walls of their new temple at Comox Street. And those paintings caused a lot more trouble than they were worth, even though financially they were worth around 5,000 Canadian dollars. At a meeting at their new makeshift temple, Edna claimed that Brother Carson had instructed them to gaze upon the orange triangle as per usual, but this time it felt different. She said she noticed Carson staring at her intently, and she stared back. It made her feel uneasy. She said he got up and put jazz music on, which was a far cry from the organ music that they normally listened to.
I felt a most peculiar sensation in the pit of my stomach, and try as I would, I could not move. Then the music turned lower and I came to. I got to my feet and said a hurried goodbye and left. I did not return to the solar temple for 5 days, but I told no one of the struggle going on within me.
When she came back, she said that she now had the ambition to become a teacher of this cult, and she claimed that the aim was to protect the oppressed against the evils of capitalism. Now, I don't exactly buy that part, because there's little talk of class struggle or railing against the bourgeoisie. It seems to be all about healing yourself with your mind and also showering Brother Carson with material possessions and money, and also making sure that he gets a wife. I'm sorry, but I think the only revolution this man had on his mind was a sexual one. When Edna's husband eventually discovered that she'd gifted 20 valuable paintings to Brother Carson in the Solar Temple, he was furious. He immediately got to work on filing a lawsuit to have them removed, and this seemed to be the thing that pushed Brother Carson over the edge, and things started to take a much darker turn.
I know there's something going on.
At some point in September, Edna claimed that Carson launched an insidious campaign to poison her mind against her husband and son, and it got incredibly disturbing.
He told me that Joey, my son, was drinking and going around with bad girls and made him out altogether as a proper little rascal. And he warned me too against my husband. He said Sam was planning to have me put into Essendale, and that he knew of a conference of 4 doctors, at which my husband was present when this decision was made.
Essendale was a mental health facility in Vancouver, and obviously her husband was concerned, but there didn't seem to be much evidence that he was planning on having her committed. And even if he was, how would Carson know about it? It sounds like outright manipulation, and it got even worse when he suggested that Edna's husband might be injecting her while she slept with a hypodermic needle.
Once, when Peter and Rebecca and I were alone, he seized my arm, pointed to the mark of the bruise, now almost vanished, and said, See the puncture marks? I am going to take you to Inspector Vance and have pictures taken of those marks and have them enlarged 100 times.
Despite never actually taking her to whoever Inspector Vance was, Brother Carson continued to tell Edna that her life was in danger. He told her that she better make sure that she cooks all of her food at home herself to avoid being poisoned. It was as if he was trying to chip away at her sense of reality, to get her to turn her back on her husband of 20 years, and even her own son, to isolate her so completely that she'd have nobody left to turn to, except for Carson himself.
On October 5th, Peter warned me that I was in dire danger of my life, and that the best thing I could do would be to take up residence at the Comox Street house, where I would be safe. The following day, I went with a woman friend to pack. While I was upstairs, my husband entered, asked the friend what I was doing upstairs, for he could hear me moving around boxes. When she told him that I was going away for a holiday, he said it was a good thing. His idea, I suppose, was to get out of the range of Peter's influence. I told him I was going to Seashore, but I did not. I went to Comox Street, taking room number 4.
Isolating Edna completely seemed to be a response to her husband filing a lawsuit in regards to the paintings that she'd gifted to Carson. While she was at the boarding house, she wasn't allowed to leave the property, and she couldn't even look out of the windows in case someone saw her. They didn't even let her downstairs to go to the temple meetings, probably due to the fact that while she was effectively a prisoner upstairs, Brother Carson was downstairs talking smack about her husband. He apparently told the congregation that he was going to wipe out her husband financially, and that he was going to take him for $56,000.
Why he hit on the sum of $56,000 I do not know, nor do I know how he expected to get it, unless it was supposed to be a sort of ransom for my return.
On the 5th day of house arrest, Edna was told that it was too dangerous to keep her there. They needed to move her to a secure location where she wouldn't be discovered. They made a big song and dance about disguising her and smuggling her out of the house.
It was suggested that I wear Peter's clothes, but I laughed at the idea because they would never have fit me. In the end, I wore a dress in which I had never appeared before, and a new hat. I also donned the coat of Verna Cameron, one of the temple members. I was told to rouge my cheeks heavily and put match black on my eyebrows and look as tough as I could.
See, Edna's husband Samuel had gone to the courts again, and he'd applied for an interim injunction restraining Brother Carson and Lucy Thorne from harbouring or enticing his wife. He'd discovered that Edna was not on holiday and that she was indeed being kept by the Solar Temple. He filed an affidavit with his application for the restraining order, where he said that in their 20 years of marriage, they'd never had any domestic disputes. That was until Brother Carson had come along. Somehow the congregation were alerted to Samuel's plans, and that's why they'd smuggled Edna out of the boarding house and into the home of a follower, Mrs. Mabel Tyson, at 3229 Kitchener Street. The home was a small bungalow, and there was only one bed. Edna slept in it with Mabel, and another bed was brought in for Mabel's 12-year-old son. All in all, Edna stayed there for 8 days, and she rarely went outside. She also never gave much of a description as to what she actually did there. Mabel was described as a grey-haired widow. She was working class, and the home was a far cry from what Edna was used to. Mabel later claimed that Edna came to her home because she was afraid of her husband. But even if she was, it seemed to be a fear inspired more by Brother Carson than anything her husband had actually done. Dr. Samuel Blumberger claimed that he had received 2 anonymous phone calls at his home. The person on the other line told him that Edna was staying in a house in North Vancouver. He then received another phone call from a person that was pretending to be Edna, begging him to come to an address in North Shore, Vancouver. The address that the person gave was later found to be fictitious, and Samuel said that the voice sounded like his wife if she was sick, and that at times the voice didn't sound like her, but at other times it did. Samuel went to the press, and on the 19th of October, the story ran on on the front page of the Vancouver Sun under the headline, "Come and Take Me Home, Missing Wife's Telephone Cry. Where is Mrs. Bloomberger?" There was no doubt that Brother Carson and the congregation had seen the front page article, because that very day, Edna claimed that a fellow follower, Verna Cameron, had come rushing into Mabel's home and was in full damage control mode. She told Edna that Brother Carson had had enough. He wanted her out. It was finally time to go home. Edna had been manipulated into thinking that her husband was trying to cause her physical harm, and now she was being told to go back to him.
We walked to where I could get a taxi, and at about 9:30 in the evening I came home. I let myself in through the back door. There was no one in the house except the maid.
The Vancouver Sun covered Edna's return, running a front page article on the 21st of October announcing that she was back home. They interviewed Samuel, and he said,
"I was not home when Mrs. Bloomberger returned, and I do not know myself at this moment what happened to her. I do know, though, that it was not Mrs. Bloomberger who telephoned me. It was someone impersonating her."
The fact that someone called to impersonate her is kind of confusing, especially when whoever it was spoke about being held against their will. If it was a member of the Solar Temple making the call, why would they exacerbate the situation by adding in that detail? Did they actually plan to hold her to ransom? And if so, did the plan just spiral out of control? And if it was someone that had had a moment of moral clarity and was like, hang on a minute, this woman's being unfairly treated, someone needs to come pick her up, then why would they give a fake address? It doesn't make much sense to me, but I'm interested in hearing what you think down in the comments. Edna decided to speak directly to the Vancouver Sun about her ordeal, and on the 2nd of November, they ran her story on the front page. She spoke about how she felt as if she had been hypnotized by Carson, that chanting and the constant staring at the orange triangle had led to her falling under his spell. The story was detailed, and she said that she felt the need to tell it.
So that other women like myself, with probably too much time on their hands, will not be taken in by charlatans who seek to exploit their yearning to seek a loftier spiritual plane in the service of humanity.
While it might be hard for some people to understand why someone like Edna would end up in a group like this, it's important to remember that these groups exercise coercive control over their followers. They get people in the door by telling them that the teachings will have a beneficial impact on their lives, that they'll manifest abundance and things will change for the better. Then, as we've seen in this case, followers are isolated from their support network. Carson told Edna that the world outside of the Solar Temple was dangerous, that she couldn't even trust her own husband because he might be trying to murder her. This put Edna in a state of fear, and Carson slowly chipped away at her sense of self to the point where she's suddenly doing things that she'd never dreamed of doing before. Who does she have if not for the Solar Temple? Who else would protect her? Unsurprisingly, the other followers of Brother Carson disputed her claims. Mabel said,
"Carson is the finest man who ever walked, and I don't care what anybody says."
and Lucy Thorne, the proprietor of the boarding house at Comox Street, also had a lot to say.
"Everything you say," she said, "is correct, only it is turned the other way around. I have lived here for many years, and there has never been a thing about me."
The Vancouver Sun ended their report by saying that Brother Carson had left Vancouver. He'd been reported in Edmonton and Toronto, but I couldn't find any record of him ever being there. His wife Rebecca was left behind in Vancouver, and Lucy Thorne claimed that she had had to bear the brunt of it all. It seemed like Carson had packed up shop and disappeared, and to this day nobody seems to know what happened to him or where he ended up. Interestingly, in one of the earlier articles in the Vancouver Sun, Edna's husband claims that Carson was out on bail pending deportation proceedings, but I'm not sure if he ever was actually deported. There was no follow-up on Edna's ordeal, except for one piece in the Vancouver Sun on December 2nd. The headline read, "Mrs. Bloomberger sues for paintings," and it said that Edna had been brought in as a co-plaintiff on her husband's legal action against Peter Carson and Lucy Thorne. So was Carson still around in Vancouver in December of that year, or did Lucy Thorne have to pick pick up the pieces. As with so many of these cases, there are no satisfying answers. I can't tie everything up neatly in a little bow and give you a good ending. I don't even know if they got the paintings back. So this is where I pass the story over to you. Yes, you, the person that's watching this, trying to have a nice time and relaxing, and now I'm giving you a job to do. While I haven't been able to find any conclusive record of Peter Carson, aka Brother Carson, outside of these stories from 1935, I wonder if you can. Let's call it a collective Weird Reads research project. You can leave your findings down in the comments, or you can find me on Instagram, Twitter, or you can even email me. And perhaps together we can answer the question, "Oh, Brother Carson, where art thou?" Thank you so much for watching the video, and also thank you to all of my wonderful patrons. If you want to support the research and creation of these videos, then you can become a patron from as little as £3 a month. That gives you early access to videos. At higher tiers, you'll get access to some podcast episodes, interviews that I haven't shared anywhere else, also videos of me just talking about things that I haven't shared anywhere else. So what are you waiting for? Join today, and I will see you in the next video.